My name is Mohamed Sharif. I am an architect living and working in Los Angeles. I was educated in the United Kingdom at a school that was ideologically clearly aligned with Mies van der Rohe's kind of outlook on design education. In fact, the school in Aberdeen in Scotland, the Sutherland School of Architecture, had, and I think still does have, a formal exchange program for undergraduates in their third year of study. And I actually was selected when I was a third year, and I spent a year in Chicago to be dipped in the baptismal font of Mies, who had, you know, this is 1990, so he had died in 69. I, of course, was indoctrinated in a kind of Miesian education and arrived at a place expecting to work in a kind of culturally and technically Miesian way. But I didn't realize I was just stepping into a huge pedagogical revolution, because that was the year that they completely changed the curriculum and invited new people in. And I ended up spending a year being very confused by a young English architect, Ben Nicholson, who I consider in a way a mentor, even though it was not, even though it's mentorship in a kind of an unconventional way. It was a complex 1 year together. Why we were looking at Michelangelo's Laurentian Library when I'm in Mies's Crown Hall, were things that were kind of a struggle, but had an enormous half-life on me, and continue to this day, like the power of that 1 year, because I learned to look at my education differently, and I learned to not take for granted what I thought was an inheritance or a tradition that I was supposed to continue to kind of do, but to, you know, to think and see differently. I then went back to the United Kingdom and finished my undergraduate and postgraduate studies there, and accidentally became a teacher, bumping into my head of school, Robin Webster, who I'll come back to in a second, definitely a mentor. I was at the end of June walking back to my school in my final year, gonna clear out my desk, leave, go to London like all of my friends, and look for a job in an architecture practice. It was still a sort of recessionary moment, kind of like in the UK, kind of a dip. It wasn't easy to get jobs. I had quite a few letters from London saying sorry. So, but still I was convinced that London was where you go as a young architect in the UK, and it is, to be honest. I bumped into my head of school, and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "This is what I'm doing." He said, "Well, why don't you stick around and teach?" I said, "Oh." And so began a long journey of incorporating an academic profile into my life, but also kind of, like most of us, inhabiting two worlds: the world of teaching and the world of practice. Robin Webster, I'll come back to him. Certainly, I think a huge catalyst and influence, and also someone who had set up a Miesian curriculum. I would say, is the same generation, maybe a little bit younger than people like Norman Foster and Richard Rogers. Came through the kind of Cambridge axis, taught by I think super influential architect teachers, public intellectuals like Leslie Martin, Colin St. John Wilson, people who maybe you've not heard of, but definitely kind of shaped the sort of post-Bauhaus modernist education in some of the schools. Robin had designed some very fine kind of Miesian structures with his partner Robin Spence, and set up our curriculum in Scotland. But as he grew into his position, had also started to kind of incorporate looking at the vernacular, looking at the landscape, looking at other modes of construction and expression. And so by the time I had come back from the States and kind of gone through my education, there was a pluralism at the school that was interesting. So that was something that I saw happen in front of my eyes, that people evolved and changed, and that conversations could expand and ways of making and thinking could expand. So Ben Nicholson, my teacher in Chicago, also an English architect, different axis. A.A. Cooper Cranbrook was one of Daniel Libeskind's proteges, and certainly had almost a kind of Monty Python way of looking at the world. So balancing a kind of a universalist, modernist, kind of Cartesian, rational way of looking at the world and constructing a world, along with that kind of curiosity. These are two kind of poles and pulls, and sort of settling into that over the course of my life has been an interesting, say, every once in a while I find it kind of a compelling dichotomy. We were talking earlier about mentors, direct or indirect. Through both, I learned to look at the work of Mies van der Rohe, to this day a very important influence in the work, but not in the way that I think that people conventionally think of Mies, as grids or flat roofs, or just kind of like to boil it down to like that, but more still kind of haunted and attracted and mesmerized and hypnotized by the weirdness in Mies, the otherworldliness in Mies, especially Mies before America, not excluding the US work, but the time in Berlin, and still find a huge source of influence and inspiration, not to repeat it, but to learn from it. Many mentors, if I start going down a list, I'm sure I'm going to miss some, and I will mention two more. One indirect, but a person that I know, that I've met a few times, and someone who I really look up to, is an English architect, London architect, Tony Fretton. I don't know if you've heard of Tony. Tony is a seminal architect who was disillusioned with architecture at a certain point after working in big offices. Tony is probably in his mid-70s now, and went and did performance art for many years, and then came back to architecture. I don't know if you've been to the Listen Gallery in London. That's one of his projects. He's certainly realized a lot of work. A generous architect, a kind of I would say a dirty modernist, in a little bit of grit, a little bit of strangeness, a kind of maybe the influence of Adolf Loos, the influence of Alvaro Siza. This is someone who writes essays with titles like Homage to Siza. So someone who's looking at architecture, imbibing architecture, and bringing the kind of gesturality of performance art in a kind of very minimalist sort of tectonic way to constructed environments that somehow produce a sense of empathy. Someone I look at a lot. And speaking of empathy, someone that I, who is a dear friend, Australian architect. She's been here for a long time. She's an Angelino now too, like myself. Julie Eisenberg from Koning Eisenberg. Julie instilled in me, working closely with her, or actually not instilled, gave me this a shared ground of productive skepticism. Not cynicism, but a sense of working with doubt. So I'm someone who's filled with a lot of doubt, and probably has a little bit of fatalism, but channeling doubt productively, helping people, helping students frame things in a way to be constructive through that lens is something that Julie Eisenberg, I really cherished my time working with her directly, because that was productive. Ideologically, fundamentally, but without fundamentalism, I'm a cosmopolitan. I'm from many places, and I'm not at all. I'm from also, how do you say it? From nowhere. And in a way, if what I found in Los Angeles is that it allows me to be all of those things, to be present and somehow in a location, but also to fade into the background, to be both rooted to certain situations, but have the kind of sense of freedom and ease of kind of intellectually moving around. I don't know if that makes sense, but I don't have a sentimental attachment to places. But I love to travel through them, if that makes sense. Yes, sure. So, and it's funny, I think it was Peter Cook, I think, who said that, and maybe sort of explains why actually a lot of English creatives end up in LA, is that its fabric is like London. It's horizontal, it's spread out, and there's a truth to that. It's a patchwork. So maybe that's why I'm sort of at home here. I mean, London was never my home, but like every English, not English kid, I mean, I thought I was English until it was pointed out to me that I wasn't English by my English friends when, at the age of 10 or 11, when ideas of difference start to become, and identity start to become much more concrete. So what I love about Los Angeles and London is that they're kind of, for me, like Anglo derive cities. Like I can wander and wonder and get lost. There are countless cities that I love, but I am not at ease in as much as I am in Los Angeles, because and then this is something that, spending time with Julie Eisenberg and her husband Hank Koenig, also a mentor for other reasons, we're all sort of we're all outsiders here, and we make of this place what we make of it, and knowing that it's not true, but it's our construct, and that it's flexible to a certain degree more than any other place, and it's informal. So I think informality for me is a critical thing. So I've lived and worked in Boston, lovely city, too formal. I've spent time in San Francisco, lovely city, too formal. And the more definitive the place is, the more itchy I get. Certainly, I had a cool great uncle, super cool. If you know the actor Yul Brynner, maybe not. He was easily mistaken for Yul Brynner. He was just the coolest guy. He was an architect who I kind of looked up to. I mean, did I know anything about buildings? No. I'd say innately for me, while he was cool, I think I was more fascinated with the fact that he had taken time off architecture to be a diplomat. So I was actually thought that, that somehow intuitively I knew that architectural education was deeply knit into like ideas of construction beyond buildings, and that there are other boundaries, and so I was, there's a diplomacy in it. So I think politically, I think the politics, the possibility of apolitics, or I intuitively knew that this was something attractive. Do I think that architecture is purely motivated by kind of a social dimension or solving problems? No. But that's why I was drawn to it. Constructing relationships. The only reason why I picked the school that I went to was because it had an exchange program with Chicago. I didn't know who Mies van der Rohe was. I had studied in high school architectural history at a high level in the UK as part of my advanced level, your final exams. So I had a decent sense of history through historians like John Summerson, but that really never kind of got past, like, let's say, the 19th century. I think America was always something that I was interested in experiencing, and so that was, and I think that it sort of gave me a long-term goal that for two years to find a way to get there in my third year. So I had a mission, which in a weird way was a transitory one, meaning it wasn't a terminal one. It was a way in to get somewhere else. And so in a way, part of the cosmopolitan outlook is to keep moving.
And do you remember which were your first impressions when you came here for the first time?
Yeah, they were actually they were physical, they were painful, because I was in a car, picked up at O'Hare Airport in a car, lovely man, the late George Shipwright, a very, very good Chicago architect, who I think had worked with Mies, certainly came out of that program and built some really, I don't know if you've been to Chicago, they call it Fake Point. But it's the curvilinear tower that's off of the loop, that's on the lake. It's basically the plan of one of Mies's unbuilt Friedrichstrasse towers. So anyway, so George picked us up, and by the time we got into the loop, my neck was stuck like this, and I was in pain because I realized I had been in the rear seat of his car looking out of the window. Oh my God, there's the Hancock Tower. Oh my gosh, there's the Sears Tower. And I'd never experienced verticality like that in my life at close quarters. So that was a vivid experience. And then fast forward 4 hours later, my next experience was a naughty one, was getting arrested by the campus police because my friend and I and a few other friends that we had known were on the top of Mies van der Rohe's Crown Hall. We climbed up one of the ladders in the I-beam and got up there and had a few drinks. So yeah, to round up, and I think this is sort of like in a way to acknowledge the community that I'm in now. The now being, this is the 10th year now of my association with the Department of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA, where I'm a full-time faculty there, as well as running my practice with my partner and also faculty colleague Todd Lynch. We have our practice here in Los Angeles, Santa Monica, where we're sitting right now. I would be remiss to not include my colleagues in the department, who I would say know me in the sense that they know my references and my kind of topics of conversation and interest, and have always challenged me to not fall into a sense of like tradition, but to keep questioning. So whether it is Neil Denari, Hitoshi Abe, Heather Roberge, Georgina Ulich, Narina Mirzayan, Ben Fryinger, friends and colleagues, they keep me on my toes, and it makes it challenges me to stay sharp. So in a way, they're my mentors, but not in a kind of the classical sense. We're fellow travelers as well, so it's nice to know that it's criticism in the best possible sense. It's constructive. So that's the way.
More like a community that everyone learns.
It's a community, and certainly Wana X, our common friend, I count very much as someone who is frank and straightforward and doesn't sugarcoat anything, and someone that you can, learn from, and who's accepting also of input. So, as I mentioned, my partner Todd Lynch and I run Sharif Lynch Architecture. It's a practice. We're in our 4th year. Each of us has a kind of a long CV prior to partnering, and in a way, like our schedules sort of like are very similar. We are at UCLA for about the sum of 1.5 days a week, split over 3 days, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, typically, with other things that come up here and there. And we spend the rest of the time in our practice. We are fortunate enough to have UCLA alumni working with us who are here full time, that we interface with on a daily basis, but who are self-motivated enough and kind of semi-autonomous enough to keep us going. So that's the kind of the logistics of it. We do have kind of spoken values of things that we don't tolerate in the office. We don't tolerate exploitation of people, meaning that we work humane hours. We don't expect people to work long hours. We just expect to be effective because we value our time with our families. Each of us has, an amazing life partner, and we both mirror each other in that we each serendipitously have 3 sons. So there's family life that's involved, and we also value our employees' family life and downtime, and encourage our employees to also to teach if they want to, and that we kind of run a fairly horizontal structure. We both have input on projects, and our backgrounds. We balance the backgrounds in terms of how we deal with certain project types. I mean, there's definitely sacrifice. I'm sure you could say that of any creative field or non-creative field. That don't want to make a claim for architecture beyond other disciplines or fields. I've learned, and again, this is something that I've learned a lot from and about from my immediate community here over the past 10 years. It's really like how you use your time. What do you do with your time? Because let's say the opportunities that are, let's say, afforded to like young Swiss architects or young French architects through the public system, through the public commissioning system, public competition system, because those are societies that still have a strong kind of infrastructural and economic support for a socio-economic structure. We don't have those opportunities here. We have other sorts of opportunities. They tend to be more like, say, entrepreneurial, or maybe there's a lot more. Look, it's also chance and luck. And as I was saying earlier, LA is still the Wild West, and your chances of getting lucky here, I'd say, are much higher. But with that said, of course, outside of private commissions like single-family residences, maybe like small multifamily residences, small interior projects, the kind of thing that you would like to work on if you were someone like my partner or I, where we were educated sort of with a public outlook, multiples, large things, urban things, rather than, there's not much opportunity, but rather than get frustrated about it, it's like, what are you going to do with your time in the meantime? And so, whether it's writing, I write essays, whether it's entering competitions, whether it's just making your own work and putting it away or looking at it in the office and not showing it to anyone else for a while, those are the things that we do. I mean, in my experience, let's say the public understanding, and by the public I mean the commissioning public, those who would seek out an architect. Generally, the ones that we've come across maybe confuse us for engineers, maybe confuse us for interior designers, maybe they confuse us for being contractors. That's not to say that's always the case, and it's not to say that it's, let's say, their deficiency. I just think that we, as a community, as a field, don't sort of project what it is that we do in the world, and then we live in a kind of a mediated society where every second TV program is about some kind of home improvement or whatever, and every single one that I've seen excludes the architect. That architect is not present. It's a communication between an interior designer, a contractor, and an owner, and some material supplier. That no mention of, we talked earlier about the building and safety, like the welfare bureaucracy that's attached to actually erecting a structure, which sometimes can get tedious. But then when you especially in a seismically active place like LA, you realize that these things are important and that they save lives and that there's actually a rhyme and a reason for them. Sort of back to the idea of maybe that I was attracted to architecture primarily because it represented a kind of politics, a kind of a field of diplomacy. Sure, there are multiple outlets for broadcasting who you are, what you do, what you like, and the commissions that you get and all that stuff. I mean, that's countless. I'd say forging communities, creating communities, is probably the best way to create awareness of the kinds of things that architects can do. Maybe it's a little bit romantic, is to make small parts of the world a little bit better. Whether it's through helping to shape legislation, meaning it can be ink on paper as writing, it can be ink on paper as drawing, it can be, there are multiple routes. And I think, if I can generalize, not too many people are sitting down and paying close attention to how to maybe construct communities or intellectual and economic stakeholders in things that will make a difference. Because, now I'm going to sound like a Marxist, I feel like we're blunted in a kind of a high capitalist world where we're atomized and individuated, and we truly don't have a sense of the public life. We have the sense of private life and public consumption and public spectacle. We're quite severed from notions of agency, notions of creating, like galvanizing movements. And again, maybe I'm romantic. I think of the early moderns, the early avant-garde, with their manifestos and their meetings. This is in a time where you would get on a boat for 6 weeks to get somewhere, or send a letter that would arrive 3 months later. When you look at the exchange of ideas, the communication of ideas of the avant-garde of the 20s and the 30s, it's shocking and like stunning, and also like, in a way, I'm shaming that we kind of don't do that We don't get together as It's sort of like it's like the cult of personality is much more important now in the sense of like the Pritzker Prize or something like that. So at UCLA, I would say objectively, when you look at the cast of characters and who brings what to the table and in what shape and what form, what are their interests, what are their foci, I would probably kind of identify as the effective generalist is someone who, I think by virtue of my education at a moment in time, comes from the tradition of, let's say, reflection and historically driven thinking. Not so much as an academic niche, but as having some grasp of the history of practices and the history of building types. So I tend to work. We have a 3-year graduate degree. I tend to work closely with the second years, as well as doing special studios. They're called option studios in the third year. In a way, I'm a constructivist. It's somewhere between composition and construction, and that's how I teach. But always sort of motivated to not merely repeat things from the past. So technology is very important. Environmental science is very important. But a sense of, I think, a big motivation for me is a renewed sense of relationships between figure and ground. They're really important. So I think the hardest thing, to let go of, I think, was perhaps my misunderstanding, or maybe, dare I say, maybe misdirected teaching at certain points in my life of a misconstrued legacy of modernist form making as being grid-based. That absorbing that for a few years and thinking that that's all you could spit out actually became all that you could spit out. And I knew I wanted to do something different. And so sort of like evolving through that over the course of one's career is, it's sort of difficult to let go of. And I think kind of like looking ahead, I'm thinking more and more these days about reconciliations rather than letting go, and kind of every once in a while looking back a little bit to look forward, realizing I think how lucky I was to have benefited from both a rational and an irrational kind of education. And while when you're a student, things make you uncomfortable, typically you complain. I'm so glad to have had that discomfort, actually. And look forward to continuing to learn from both. I started my architectural education in the UK when, let's say, high tech was at its height. Norman Foster's Hong Kong Shanghai Bank had just been realized. Rogers' Lloyd's of London had just been realized. Architects like Nick Grimshaw, Richard Horden, large practices like Ovarup, those were what we were taught to look at. But I was secretly also going to the library and looking at things that nobody was touching, and perhaps because they were precious and expensive and they were on the top shelves. But Alvin Boyarsky, what he did at the AA was amazing, and the output of the AA, the publications, the folios. I remember seeing Zaha Hadid's planetary architecture folio, Himmelblau's folio. So I was looking at stuff that I did not understand. And I was like, what? Architects don't do that. High tech, that was the moment in which I was kind of dipped in architecture. That was acknowledged to be, let's say, a kind of perfection of Miesian modernism. That even though the shapes and the forms were maybe like echoing 19th century in engineering, it was still kind of like technology and rationalism and functionalism were being taken to new heights, new building types, tall towers, atrium buildings, all that stuff. I then spent some time in Chicago to, let's say, perfect that stuff, but ended up walking into a moment that was a radical rupture from that, and was taught by someone who would, let's say, kind of irrational. If I were to pair him up with a previous period of time, it would be more like Dada and Surrealism. The nephew of a seminal modernist English painter, Ben Nicholson, same name. And then, like I said, I came back to Scotland to complete my studies. Aberdeen is a very imageable city, a very tangible city with its urban kind of footprint, the fabric that it's made of. So ideas of, let's say, reading Aldo Rossi, thinking about the continuity of the city, then that sort of became an influence. Realizing that the architects that we were looking at that time were then young practices like Herzog de Meuron had just, were really kind of starting to kind of come into their own, realizing that they had been taught by Aldo Rossi, that was starts to kind of construct the cosmos where you could sort of be, let's say, continue in the kind of the vein of modernism, not as a style, but let's say as an ethos, but also think about the continuity of urban fabric. That was something. And of course, the backdrop of all of this was the backlash against all of that, which was postmodernism. So I fast forward to where we are right now, and never in my life did I think that history would repeat itself again. It's sort of, what is it? Once is tragedy, twice is farce, but I don't mean it that way. So I think we, maybe unsurprisingly, and we could have a 3-day symposium about this, are reliving another stylistic postmodernism and a pluralism that I didn't see coming. So I was an analog student. I come from a time where it was, it was by hand. As I was leaving school in the UK, computers were starting to come into the studio. That had happened in the US a couple of years earlier, and certainly my colleagues at UCLA, Greg Lynn, Neil Denari, were kind of ushering in the digital age. I missed that boat as a student and producer of that from that time, and I must say it was a difficult moment for someone like me to be immediately estranged from the pedagogical community, because that was the prime motivator of the discourse at the schools in which I've taught at SciArc, I've taught at Cal Poly Pomona, I've taught at RISD on the East Coast. RISD not so much. RISD was always skeptical, kind of about, right? But I felt a little bit shut out, not because people told me that I was shut out, but I found the discourse exclusive. And so a generalist like me, kind of educated in the kind of the technical, reflective, literary tradition, kind of like European modernist education, seemed like an anachronism all of a sudden. So that was a weird, rude awakening, to complete something, to be ready for the world and find that A, that world didn't exist, meaning society, and B, that the tools with which the last of the Mohicans were going to work, I did not know how to use. And so, and you kind of, so, I mentioned Tony Fretton earlier, a very important kind of source of inspiration. And of course, for my generation, for the kind of like the punk modernist kids, we were of course looking at Rem. We were visiting the Kunsthal, the National Dance Theatre. We were visiting any project that Ome had just built, Congrexpo and Lille, and realizing that what we wanted to do was maybe a repetition, but not a mimicry of the kind of architecture, and I think that's ultimately when I say I'm a kind of a constructivist, that people like the Smithsons were, that Alison and Peter Smithson were doing, values of Denise Scott Brown, of the ugly and the ordinary, and that we like a kind of gritty, coarse, direct, frank, but not moralistic kind of modernism. These days I find myself fascinated with practices like Brother in Paris, Brandelhuber in Berlin, direct, frank, brute, somehow a little bit unfinished, somehow a little bit open. And that's the kind of work that we want to do, which is tough when people come to you and they want you to make something polished and they want to know where the sock drawer is, and so we're not bourgeois. I wasn't raised with bourgeois values, so.
Well,
but it's a sort of an expected kind of decorum of what you deliver as an architect. So that's tough.
Especially in the US, I think.
Absolutely, it's a consumer culture, and the biggest, the best, the shiniest, and shouldn't look too different from other things. Even though we want to be special, yeah. And so that's where we are.